not the least of it. I've been thinking about this subject a lot, the next school, I've been thinking about it for almost 30 years. And this school has gone through a number of iterations. We still have our roots in the past. We still enjoy this gathering space that was designed in 1957 and built in 59. There's a kind of continuity, there is a sense of history. But I think in some ways everything has changed. And everything has changed 3 or 4 times in the time that I've been teaching. And I've been thinking about, there was a kind of observation that has really impacted me recently. It's a very simple phrase, but I'd like to lead up to it by introducing something about the potency of the English language, which allows us to get an idea across quite powerfully and very quickly. And then the first ones are kind of, you'll find them a bit vague and not so relevant, and then I'll gradually work down to something a bit more relevant. So F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote once that the rich are different. It's kind of a powerful essay in a handful of words about the kind of social conditions that we live in. One of my favorite quotes from Gertrude Stein is when she was asked to describe America, she said, "Consider a space filled with moving." And in that very simple kind of paraphrase, she kind of captured the energy of the 1920s and 30s America, full of migration and transformation and in some ways colonization. The philosopher Merleau-Ponty has struggled with the idea of a philosophy of everything, to follow the physicists. And he talks about his thoughts in the context of something that he calls the frantic spectacle of the world. In other words, there's so much going on, you can't possibly assume control of all the ideas. But I've been inspired by a man from Iceland, Porter Torfason. Porter is a musician, he's in his early 80s. And he did something quite fundamental with just a very few words in 2008. On the occasion of the economic collapse of Iceland, he approached the steps of the Parliament building in Reykjavik and started simply saying 2 phrases: what happened and what do we do next? What do we do now? And he kept repeating that. The word got out that he was making this pronouncement. The crowd gathered, and it led to the overthrow of the government of Iceland. And it was the beginnings of a kind of recovery period following such a massive economic collapse. What happened, and what do we do now? And I think in answering that question, the words that come to my mind are instinct, premonition, anticipation, prescience, and vision. So the question is not about can we operate in a scenario that involves a frantic spectacle, but can we understand the gifts that we bring to the table as designers to enter that complex world. And prescience has to do with some uncanny sense that you in fact know what will happen. I'd like to use Johanna Hurme as an example of how the future is not so hard to find. I did a studio with her many, many years ago, and at the midterm, it happened to be out in the Great Plains, southeast Saskatchewan, and in the middle of the term, at the intermediate, I suggested that she stop drawing and that she start just building a very careful model of her idea. So wandering out of the little smoking lounge onto the parking lot one day, there was Johanna burning her drawings in the snow. I came across those photographs just a few days ago as I'm slowly beginning to clean up my office and my files. So fast forward to a few days ago when I went to visit Johanna and Sasha in their office, and you can't help but be impressed by all the models around them and the ways in which they are so devoted to the kind of the facilitation of an idea through fabrication and through spatial dynamics. Now, it's impossible, I think, to introduce the firm fully. There's so much work that's gone on, there's so much production that's happening. It's kind of a constant energy and an engine of seeking out what's next. A perpetual creative machine. But if you zoom to their website at some point, you can even do it in this lecture, there's a beautiful line of projects from beginning to end. You can kind of see all their work in a glance, just through it. It's really quite fantastic. The projects that stand out in my mind are actually the ones that aren't built. Strangely enough, there's a very beautiful Canadian canoeing center, for example, a really exquisite building. Why it didn't win, I don't know. It's impossible for me to imagine that that building is left in an archive somewhere. And also their beautiful Victoria Art Gallery proposal, equally kind of stunning. And so it seems to me that in understanding their firm's work, one has to say that there's this perpetual desire to step into the next world, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. It's just a habituated kind of sense of research, of promise and opportunity, kind of against all odds. So with that, I want to introduce Johanna, who's going to talk about the next practice in the next school. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for having me. I'm obviously humbled to be in this this setting and this crowd, and really want to preamble the discussion that it's intended to be an open question, and by no means am I here to, serve answers to anybody or experts in your field and what you do, but we're hoping to bring a perspective from the practice world and how we might knit the new practice and the new school in our minds together, and where that intersection could be strengthened. So just some open questions for all of us. I'm not one to speak in big words. I've sort of adapted, maybe because I'm an immigrant and maybe because I'm kind of under the weather and trying to make excuses here, but I sort of believe that language is meant to communicate and not build walls, so I'm being as straightforward as I possibly can through this talk. So I first wanted to just, it's pretty tiny, hopefully you can read that, but the idea that we feel like we have a bit of, through our experiments over the last 13 years, have a bit of a practice ecosystem that I wanted to share with you first and what goes into that. And then wanted to talk about where we see the division between the practice and academia occurring at the moment, and why we think it's worth discussing how those could be knitted closer together. Illuminating some of that through our recent teaching experiments here and elsewhere, and then also at the end where we might try to lead the conversation in the next little while, in the next 2 years, from our little corner, and hoping to find as many partners and collaborators in that. So first to that, this practice ecosystem. Now I'm not sure why I have, I see. Sasha has been tampering with my slides, so it looks very exciting here. But the idea that we sort of believe that, this is impossible. Sasha, what did you do? Okay, well, they'll get bigger. But the idea is that the practice is sort of multifaceted in a sense that it is not only about what we would conceive of architecture or conceiving architecture to be on a daily basis, so that practice part of it, but what goes into design advocacy, what goes into trying to build a financial model that's sustainable so that we can have the luxury of contemplating things and doing things that aren't billable hours, like somebody else mentioned there earlier. And so the thought is that it's in a way, we hope also ties in what we learn in school and how we might look at that hybrid, that osmosis in the future. So most of you know we practice around a single table, and the idea being not so idealistically democratic. There's decisions that get made by partners and people in charge of money ultimately, but the idea being that you can actually voice your opinion regardless of that innate hierarchy. And so I'm just going to touch on these a little bit. So obviously the practice part, some of our past work, a lot of it's been focusing on what we think is the sort of acute, bigger need in the world. It isn't about sort of the high architecture, maybe because we weren't lucky enough to get there, but also because we believe that that's where the need is. That's where we need practitioners to do better work from a day-to-day basis to affect the lives of sort of ordinary people. And of course, we also believe that in order to get some of those things done, that you have to be more than somebody who can do forms or conceive of space skillfully, but also you have to be a strategist in that scenario so that you have an effect on politics, that you can pull strings that you need to pull to make things a reality. So that's sort of the practice world and the things that are going on. We started super hyper local. I think still, there's a slide later, about 95% of our people who have come through the years have been U of M grads, and we're proud of it. And then now kind of leaping out of Winnipeg to other places, not that far at the moment, but at least to Calgary, where we have a significant amount of work going on. And then I think what are the components of that so-called critical practice, and sort of the value term on that, but to try to stay at pace with the world is obviously design competitions. Oftentimes those are very much collaborations with others, including Jay in many cases and others from the academic world. We also do love to be invited here and there to be instructors at the universities, even though we of course again recognize that somebody devoted to that day-to-day is better equipped to really build the ability for you to think deeply about issues and develop your own ideas. But we think we also have a role where we can plug in. We pursue things like awards and publications, we're on juries and do those things just to sort of be able to see where we fit in the world and what might be relevant and what's going on. It's often you get a good cross-section being on a jury, for example, to see what the practice world is thinking and where their ideas are headed. Again, with Jay, very lucky to have been curators of the Venice Biennale in 2012, so that's going back to sort of exhibitions and trying to bring work of students and young architects in this case to the broader audience across Canada and then ultimately ultimately to Venice. And then, of course, we've invested a whole heck of a lot in design activism. Those are the sorts of things that Sasha always tells me are lose your shirt projects. But I do think that there's a value in us holding ourselves accountable to the world as a practice and not just being insular about it, but trying to contribute where we can when we are in a profession where we still make money and profit. And so those are including the Peter Rome project in 2013, which then led to Table for 1200, the first edition, which then got adopted by Storefront for their fundraising efforts for years to come, to Share Your Idea, which was a competition asking for ordinary citizens to contribute design ideas and write these into sort of objects, chairs to sit at and have a conversation in the city. Exhibitions of different sorts. This was a collaboration with EQ3 in Toronto for the Toronto Design Festival. And then things that are design activism, also tried to give back through One Bucket at a Time, which was installation in Mexico City, and Winnipeg Design Festival, collecting money to a girl orphanage in Mexico City. And to then, a bit more commercially, trying to collect a pool of design thinkers in Winnipeg and creators and local makers into something called Design Quarter Winnipeg, again, trying to figure out the financial model for this, and then getting it off the ground so that we could promote Winnipeg as a design destination. So that was at the core of that idea. It's still running today, now coming to 3 years, and fairly proud of that initiative. One thing, of course, we don't talk about, and it almost feels sometimes that you're looked down upon for talking about it, is the financial part of it. And I think this is an area where we don't touch a lot on in academic setting, unless that's changed since I've been aware. But we also try to make sure that the students and interns that come in touch with us, that are aware of what their value is and how to value themselves, so that we can collectively value our profession and stop the erosion of it in the sort of public eye. And so this is an example of where we sort of landed about 6 years ago, trying to improve the kind of financial picture for most of our people in the office. And so we made 100% of our finances transparent to the office, then invented this incentive program that on top of what we tried to make competitive salaries, they would also get a sort of a collective pool of money if we were successful that they could share in. So it's sort of, I haven't decided whether that's sort of a capitalist or a communist system, but it's somewhere in between. And we've been actually, because of that collective responsibility, we've been actually very, very surprisingly successful over the last 6 years. So the average, if you're 52 weeks in the seat at the office, obviously you have holidays, but you know what I mean, then this has been kind of like the recent outcome. I've crossed up some names for privacy, but so basically what it's done for us is that all of a sudden, on top of our base profit, a little bit off topic here, but you get to then also take home nearly $7 extra every hour that you've worked, in essence, as a result of the program. And if we're not collectively successful, then there's no payout. So that's kind of the collective responsibility. And it's not only the monetary one, but then a few years back, we went back and tried to figure out, what is the office, what do the staff think are important milestones or keys for us to feel good about what we do and how we do it. And we came up with, through a survey, this list of priorities. So in terms of how we function in the office, how we divvy up work, that was one of them. It's an ongoing issue. It's not bolded for that reason. But we've been able to hit almost every one of them, except one of my lines has moved. The food was not important, so nobody wanted to have a collective meal plan. So that's out. But everything else we've been able to figure out, and our newest thing is the sabbatical there. So now what we're doing, we're trying this for the first time this year, is that we have up to 6 months sabbatical, 3 months full pay, 6 months you can amortize over, and everybody, after they hit 10 years in the office, they get the sabbatical. So we're trying to find ways for people to feel refreshed and have new ideas and so on. So that's one of those, I put it under financial success, but that's what it means. If we wouldn't be successful financially, we wouldn't be able to do some of these things. When I was at the MAA, I spearheaded something called MAA Procurement Task Force, which was trying to advocate for quality-based selection for architectural services in the profession. And so it's also trying to sort of have these prongs of influence into the politics and into the bigger decision makers. Back to some design activism, we also installed this container of our own pocket, basically the money to try and activate the edge of Bijou Park in the Exchange that can then become different exhibitions or happenings or just a bar here and there. And again, constantly trying to figure out how we would be able to contribute. Another one, a similar thing, is the shamefully Airbnb unit on the top of the 62M, but the real idea behind that is that if we can make the finances work so that we rent this thing out on Airbnb for, I think it's 4 days of the month, then we can actually have it for free for the rest of the time. So that pays for the expenses, and we offer it to anybody who's visiting. I'm sorry to say I didn't reach out, but if anybody wants in the future, now your staff know that we have an artist stay there, and if you have a visitor to the city, they're for the cleaning fee, free to stay here too. Sasha's mom is the cleaner, so she needs to make a living, so that's why there's a cleaning fee. A couple of years ago, we also implemented the idea that we have a budget, it's 20 grand a year, to give to other design activities that we're personally not in charge of, but warehouse or grad something. And then the staff is in charge of it, so Jen currently handles this in the office, and these are some of her slides from presentations to the other group members. This year, our latest design activism was installing these walk signs all over Winnipeg, and we were trying to keep it quiet and not tell anybody because we thought we might get in trouble, and we're in trouble with the city already enough. And so, sure enough, and then eventually though became this big discussion on social media, and there's a CBC story that went out, and all kinds of experts were contemplating of where these came from and so on. And of course, ultimately, the goal was to have the city sort of step up, because if you go through the proper channels, admittedly, even the manager of transportation at the city of Winnipeg said that it would take about 6 years probably to get that project off the ground. And so then he contacted us. Finally, they had somehow figured out that we were behind it, and now the conversation, we weren't sure, was originally going to go in I was scared that they were going to try and nail us for this and give us some fines for each of the signs, but fortunately it's gone in the direction where they're actually interested in making them permanent. I was the chair of the Winnipeg Chamber a couple of 2 years ago now. It's a year-long term, and through that also try to speaking numbers, I guess, or speaking the language of the business community to try to advocate for a greener strategy for our urban design in the city, and fortunately that resulted in a chamber policy that was handed to the city, and some of that at least got incorporated into our Winnipeg, from what I understand. A result of that was trying to also write about it, and got invited to write a chapter with Sylvia Albert, from the Dean of Economics at the U of W, and that book came out last spring, I think. And so again, we don't do enough of that. We're not writers. I find it terribly painful, but we are currently trying to do a publication through the IIT on some of our work there on housing, but it's taken much longer than I was hoping. So back to the osmosis then in the city. So what we've been trying to do, or in our office, sorry, what we've been trying to do ever since the beginning is to have various groups take part and be part of the office environment, including the Winnipeg Architecture Foundation, who have this little space and are our storefront, in effect, at the front of the office. Thea Pedersen, who's the ED of Design Quarter now, occasionally works in the office. So she pops in, and just because she would be otherwise alone at home, pops in and does some work there. Same thing with the storefront now with the passing of Dave Penner. We've had storefront staff working with us at the table. And the idea is that, again, like trying to expand our own sphere of how we operate and where we operate, and try to share some of the ideas. Again, this is within the design bubble, but then we also have our Calgary developers just establishing a desk in our office so that they can have a Winnipeg base. They're now doing a project in Winnipeg, and so that's equally sort of important interaction for us to learn and to continue to make sure that the ideas are shared. And as I mentioned, the alumni, there they are. There's about 45 or something, and only this little group here is not associated with this university. And so we've been fortunate enough to have all these great brains that are on the table through the years, some of whom have gone off to start their own offices and so on. So particularly proud of them for doing that. And then I guess that maybe brings me into sort of as a bridge to the issue with or not the issue, but the topic of conversation about the practice and academia together, and why we think it's an important conversation to have. Now, I've read, so these are opinions of others, but that there's a lot that this division has existed for 100 years between practice and academia, in a sense, and maybe for good reason. But I do want to bring into question, and we should, I think, question that also, that is that the best possible model to go forward with. Here's from Nazar Fraser and Fisher: architect's cultural importance does not translate into power in the economic or political realms. And I think this is part of the issue, and why I think it's important that we try to work through a collaborative effort to strengthen our position in the world. I do think that the architectural profession, the field of study, has so much to offer on how we could be living better, how obviously our environment would benefit from good design thinking and so forth. And so it just feels that that continuous erosion, part of it is on the practice for letting it happen. Part of it perhaps is that we are not maybe arming our people enough that they can go there and defend this position in the world. And so I think that somehow we need to, if we do want to have a say in the world and we want to take part in these important conversations, that we have to claw back that space. So again, I'm not suggesting that architecture solves every problem in the world, but again, I think we do have a role to play. Thomas Fisher, I think, was here on Thursday, and I love these couple of quotes from him. He says that too much of architecture today is too leopard-like, too superficially attractive or visually compelling, without the content that comes from grappling with the real problems of our time. And secondly, and too much of the architectural education focuses on the discipline's internal arguments rather than contemporary concerns and how the physical environment relates to them. So again, the practice world certainly has a role to play, because this is the kind of stuff, I think they call this stumpies in some article anyway, that it's prolific around North America, this kind of architecture. We should particularly, Sasha actually told me that I found a very good example of a stumpy, so I don't know if you still hold that opinion, but so I think that the profession has somehow allowed handing the power over to the to development world, or the construction managers or contractors, who much rather not deal with the architects and find it simpler to act through the contractors and so on. And then we lose that direct connection to be able to talk about ideas and the value of them to the end payee, at least, if not the end user. And so somehow have to take that responsibility, and that we have to hold our end of the bargain in that, if we want to come together with you here in the school and try to figure out how we could work together. I think it was mentioned that it's been this sort of a hybrid, or the thought of the hybrid has existed for quite some time, that you get your core values established in the school, and then you go into the profession and learn some real skills. is how that's been framed in the past. But I do think what's fundamentally an issue there is that I'm afraid for the students who come out and then see the two as completely different disciplines, and then become, in my mind to the detriment of the world, become so quickly cynical about what's actually possible to accomplish in the real world afterwards, and then kind of just get into that corporate groove and do what they're told, and sort of don't see the possibility out. So that's the part that we would humbly like to fix. This is not about us getting billable hours or more value for our company right off the bat, but it's about how do we act in the world? How do we make it better? How do we produce better outcomes for architecture in general, and allow the public to believe in us again? And so that's what I'm worried about. So in the other extreme, then I went to do a lecture in a U.S. university last spring, and looking around the firms, I was very, very impressed with this impressive looking work. But then it all started to be the same. I mean, I have 40 pictures that looked this way in every room. It was a year-end exhibition. And then the question to me is that, of course, yes, this is impressive, and we are not, when we teach studio, ever able to get this kind of good-looking, sexy work out of our students. But that there's also a sort of a question is what is the, nothing's closed in, there's no envelope, there's nothing that I can take this and somehow translate it into practice world. I hope that's not too harsh to say, but I also then wonder what the value is with these incomplete models or drawings. Evoke a certain sensibility, and that's great if that happens in certain studios. But when it happens in a school for the entire year-end exhibition, you can imagine that that's all there was. And I just worry about that also as a way that how do we prepare the students to battle the battles that are ahead, which again affect all of us. So I don't think we can blame individual schools or offices even for the disconnect between the design and practice, because they're part of this culture that's existed for so long. And that's a mindset that we can trace back for centuries in the Western culture anyway. It's sort of the dichotomy between like art and business, thinking and doing. And somehow I think there's room to try to knit those two together. And I think we have to question the dichotomies. So I guess maybe part of it, and at least what we hear from our colleagues, is the concern that we're sort of underpinning the thinking education within the humanities as opposed to the technical, and the technical always gets sort of left behind. And somehow because of and again, the blame is not necessarily on you or anything, but I think what's happening is that the field of architecture, what we have to know today, is so vast compared to when we were stacking stone together and being sort of master builders, where we could think about space and form and the ideas behind it solely. Now we have to know all about the kind of technology and material and all that goes into it, and so it's impossible to fit that in the curriculum. But the question is that then also sometimes when we look at a beautiful architectural outcome, or we look at the less convincing one, it sometimes boils down to, do you know how to question how flashing is done? And so where do we teach that, or how do we connect the idea between an architecture to its detailing, for example? And that is tough to learn. And what I'm concerned about is about the 10 years that it takes for a student in our office or elsewhere to get to the point where they can question us and bring their fresh ideas to us so that we can be challenged and we can do better. So in any case, and then this is old now, but from the EAA prize, first prize winner, 5 Critical Horizons for Architectural Education in an Age of Distraction. So this was a writing competition at the time. The author was sort of saying that there are so many distractions in the world, and we can't possibly let those distractions to come to the educational world. And even the jury chairman then said it should become a primary responsibility for architectural education to share their vision with the society rather than reacting to society. And so it feels, those parts to me always feel a little bit arrogant, that somehow I think we have to share the collective. And again, maybe they've changed their mind, maybe this is outdated, but that's sort of, I guess, that's a warning point. On a personal level, what we find difficult to deal with is sort of the lack of collaboration that I still see in architecture schools between different disciplines, and I think this was discussed a little bit before, but also between even each other, that, you know, it's a team effort, and we continue to, I think, in a way, try to promote the idea of the star architect who's going to have the design ideas and solve them solely and heroically in the world. And if we could somehow instill in students that there's so much more that goes into it, and we don't need those architecture heroes, we need good team players. And I also think that there's sort of a singular understanding of what an architect is, which is, again, that person who does the design work. But the reality is that about 10% of your time in the profession is spent on design, and the rest of the 90 is where you're being convincing, you're selling ideas to somebody else, where you're thinking about what something costs so that you can afford it, where you're doing, I don't know, material research or something that is not of the design. And when we look at that proportion of what we've been taught, again, some of it falls on the practice, but maybe at least that we don't devalue those team members that we have today in our practice who don't do design architecture. They do project management, or they and to do that well is a huge skill that we don't talk about, and I think we devalue, and so people feel embarrassed to say that they're not in the design business in a sense when they're in the practice world. But anyway, so having said all that, again, I emphasize that it's a shared responsibility, and practitioners need to do better. Practitioners complain about these things that I've already talked about, and how, you know, they feel that academia looks down upon the value of their kind of mundane day-to-day practice and refuse to contribute to it. That would be what a typical Winnipeg practice will complain about, and that we don't participate in lectures and events in the, or you don't, sorry, in lectures and events in the city, whereas the, academics that I've talked to basically complain about the same thing reverse. So practice looks down upon the value of academia and refuses to contribute meaningfully, or poor participate in lectures and events at the school. So, I mean, I guess this is just, my list of sort of compiling what I think is that we do have the same goals, and we are a part of the same community, and we just have to somehow get over the red tape and work together to build a better future for the students and for ourselves in the world. And it all boils down to, like, how do we maintain relevance in the world? We have so much to tackle in our backyards here in Winnipeg, just directly, that require skill sets like you are developing and having here. And it's not sort of a vacuum that I think at least there are some that will go into different pursuits, and we have to pursue the theory of architecture for the practice for the practice to generally move forward and the world to move forward. But at the same time, we need people to join the army of architects to try and do positive change in the world. And so just quickly touching on a couple of these, the environment, of course, is huge. And yet, our city keeps expanding outwards. Like, here's a real thing that we could be affecting. If Winnipeg was the density of Paris, we would fit in from downtown to Polo Park in that little area. And you can imagine what a waste this is. It's much more than an individual building. This is on the urban scale. So, and then maybe you've seen the scary map that the city of Winnipeg just released, but since 1971, our population increased about 37% in the city, and yet our land area increased 96%. And the city has just announced how much more land they're going to claim around that, and yet we can't afford anything, which is ridiculous, since over 70% of our public services and city budget taxes are going towards things that are related to distance. So when you complain about, or you see roads that are crumbling and so on, it's no wonder that we have a $7 billion infrastructure deficit. And so these are the things that we want people to talk about, and we need more people to voice so that they're hard issues, so that we can affect the public opinion and therefore the decision makers to make a better world. So density, this is a similar thing, but just a couple of interesting stats. 62.9% of Winnipeg's households are single-family detached houses. So actually less than I thought before I started the research. But by comparison, my hometown, Helsinki, 7.7% of population lives in single-family homes. And the populations are about equal in size. And so you can imagine what value that holds. Even just over 20 years, I think I calculated it's $4 billion. Just there, like if we were to put our growth, our new growth, we don't have to change anything that's existing, but our new growth into the existing city, that's what we could save in service costs alone. And yet what's interesting that's happening is that for the first time in the Canadian population, singles represents the biggest segment of population. So 1 in 2 households, even in Winnipeg, constitute 62% of the population. And yet we're still building the suburban house, as a bigger segment of new production. Yeah, so here's the $4 billion thing. So compared to Halifax, which calculated that there's about a $2,000 difference annually in just the sheer service costs between urban and suburban home for the city, and this is ongoing service costs, this is not capital costs or anything. If we looked at the next 25-year horizon for Winnipeg, who have to build about 80,000 new homes, that is a $4 billion difference. I don't need to go into that. I've probably spent too much time on this. I'm passionate about this stuff, and this is what I was trying to preach at the chamber, but also the value of walkability and livability for our well-being. So there's some good political and business stats that go along with it, how we undervalue the walkability and how we overvalue the car still is a problem for us today. I'm optimistic that will change, but it is definitely something that we're battling day to day still in the discussions in the public forum. Health and well-being of people. If your commute is 40 minutes or longer, 45 minutes or longer, you're 40% more likely to get a divorce. So there's some real implications to our sprawl. Or the long-term health benefits of being lonely are equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And so this isolation that seniors, for example, feel in communities that are bedroom communities only has a long-term effect on our mental health. People are in neighborhoods with sidewalks are 50% more likely to meet physical activity guidelines. So just something very simple. You walk around Charleswood and there's no sidewalks. So it's simple things that we should be advocating for, we should be cognizant of. And of course, affordability and how big of a business this day-to-day architecture that I'm talking about is. So the value of global real estate is about 217 trillion US dollars, 60% of the value of all global assets, with residential real estate comprising 75% of that. And yet we perceive housing architecture to be one of the most mundane things that an architect can really do and sort of boring and so forth. And here's a huge opportunity for us to care and be effective in. Also, there is, even from Canadians, 6.76 million Canadians. I don't think I meant to have a dollar sign there, but anyway, 6.7% maybe? No, millions Canadians, but not the dollar sign, live under the affordable, don't have affordable housing. So again, this is an enormous issue that, as I'm sure you've heard in the media, that is getting worse and worse, and our gap between the rich and the poor is getting there too. One of the good stats to understand where this is coming from is obviously the political structure and how we hear what we value. Only about 5% of Canada's total population lives in social housing. Contrasted the number in Northern Europe with the social democratic countries of 33% of Swedish population lives in social housing, 34% of Netherlands population lives in social housing. And in the Netherlands, about 45% of housing stock in Amsterdam is provided by nonprofit social housing corporations. So again, something that we could tackle in order to in order to try to have an impact on this to shift. So it's just some of the bigger issues. The theory and practice, we'll see how this goes. Sasha made these slides. Woohoo! So could we talk to one another? And then, sorry, that's my notes that I didn't need to leave here. Okay, there we go. So then I guess I wanted to share a few of the recent experiments in teaching that we've been trying to do to try to bridge that gap and maybe try to prepare from our part the students for some of those battles ahead. We've been active in the teaching environment here and elsewhere since, I guess, Sasha since 2003, and I joined him in 2007, and then Colin, who's left a little bit later, 2014 according to this. Is this correct? Something like that. But so the first example is the studio we did in 2015 at the U of M called Next Urbanity, and this was the modeling the railside development that's happening at the Forks, and we were actively working on at the time. And where the value, I think, comes back to all of us was the fact that the client, so the Forks, Development Corp, was affected positively and by the whole student engagement. So they basically did a shadow study or model of what the development could be. And again, while the results of the student work aren't as compelling in terms of the visual of them, there was a real value that got put back into the community in a sense that now the CEO was convinced that this is something that could work. We were able to then take some of those thoughts and compile them with our professional work and make the concept plan document that's still guiding the development today. And again, it is moving forward. It's just been delayed with waiting for some of the funding from province and the city. And so I don't need to speak to this in any detail, just saying that this 11-acre area that we gave the students to inhabit according to some of the guidelines that were discussed and tackled in the studio, and each of the students took a partial and then tried to work with their neighbors to negotiate how to build together and be the developers of the site. They had to be in charge of some of the financial parts of it, as well as trying to create community activity on the ground floor, develop all kinds of guiding principles and diagrams as well. Midterm resulted in a sort of a working model that they kept changing and working through together. And then, of course, this then led into further development in detail and envelope studies and trying to sort of see how do we, once we actually encase the buildings in something that can withstand the weather in Winnipeg, how does the design get dumbed down and how do you lift it up back from there so that you still have something compelling left? And I think that's something that takes practice over and over again, and so that we can expect something more than those stumpies that I was sharing from the future practitioners. And that's really, I guess, been our hope and a goal in all of this. This is from the final presentation, which again we did at the Forks, and I do love the idea that we branch out, because people are incredibly attracted to everything that happens in school models and getting your head into them, and so it's just so passers-by, even to be able to share some of those images and visions for the site, instigated all kinds of conversations at the Forks with just ordinary people who would love to see more of what we do and who would love to be engaged with the architecture. So at least I think we have to give public the chance to do so. And again, as I mentioned, then that led to the concept plan and has since then spawned other things, like we're working on a concept plan for a similar sized housing area in Calgary, where affordability is a big factor. It's in an immigrant community and so on. And so how do we I guess, equip the students to try and have an understanding, a bast understanding of all of the pieces that go into that. So I think part of the reason we then got invited to IIT last term was to run a affordable, attainable housing studio there for the students, and at the same time also do a course in detail building so that we could integrate the detail course with the studio course. Again, so that the students would understand that the calls that they make in studio have a real impact on how they can actually conceive of the building. The other thing we did to try to expand the field of learning and make it sort of work with our office is that we have a travel program through which we tend to try to do educational things and sometimes fun things. But so everybody in the studio who wanted to go to, in the studio being the practice studio, to go to Chicago for 2 weeks, they could, and then they could be TAs for the students. They're kind of lowering the bar of being able to ask dumb questions and don't feel stupid about it, asking your actual instructors. And so this was our roster of TAs that came, and it was really positively received by the student body there because they thought that they would have more variety in perspectives, and some of these kids, the staff members here thought technical courses, and some did more studio setting DA parts of the job. We also got the students, and again, I'm sorry you can't really read this, but do performance for all of their housing. So first they had to establish, what is the land value, what does it cost to build on it, what's construction cost per square foot, what should it cost, where they can find the grants to be able to put some affordable units in there, how do they do the business scenario, so some of those market rate units pay for the affordable suites and so on. And so it was really interesting to see them tackle this, and at least I think even if they didn't get all of the formulas right, they understand the big picture about how difficult or where the challenges lie in trying to bring affordable housing to the masses. And then we also went, and I know somebody will say, well, this is spoon-feeding the students information, but we also tried to teach the basics of planning so that, how do you quickly look at something like, do you have enough perimeter to do 2-bedroom suites for the 6 stories and have this many, and so on, how you quickly test that. And so again, it's pretty rudimentary stuff, but at the same time, it was obvious that nobody had heard about efficiency ratios or double loaded versus single loaded corridors and how much envelope you can afford to build in the monies that you have, and how does the suite layout affect the parking layout below, and how do you bring the structure down into the ground, and how that all has to be thought of together, and how you have to quickly test it before you can fall in love with some idea that you're not going to be able to build then, because the housing corp you're working for only has so much cash. And then how to make better quality judgments from that. So we looked at anything from these kinds of scenarios that I'm just flipping through quickly here to then what does that mean at building scale? When you have more perimeter, you have more natural light, but you have a longer corridor as a result of that, so you have less efficiency. And how do we marry those together, and how do we make best judgment calls about the balance between those and still be able to deliver value to the end user, so to all people that we're responsible working for, so some of those scenarios. And then this was tied together with the technical courses, or where we were trying to teach about variety of building materials, their behavior, how you detail something, how do you take the idea of your design studio project and actually build details that are akin to it or emphasize that design thinking. And so we had sort of real life examples where students could investigate this at the deeper level, I think, because it was directly applicable to their own work, from concrete work to metal work, and looking at what goes into trying to develop a custom detail for a building. Like the example here that Ken probably pulled his hair out for many months on. And so I think what sort of felt valuable, and again, not the sexiest project out there, but felt valuable at the end, that we had lots of kind of feedback from that this was something that they really needed to get out there, and that they've had, and they need to have, a lot of the thinking courses before then, where you would almost not, as a colleague in Vancouver at UBC was saying, foregrounding limitations, but you're allowing the ideas to flow freely first, but then later on in some advanced studio course that you put those limitations back and then see where you can get with the with the thinking on projects, and to really try to sort of, I guess, teach the students where those limitations were, where they could challenge them, and most importantly, where they could challenge them when they go in the work world again, so that they don't get cynical, so their boss will simply tell them that, you know what, that's technically not going to fly and forget it, which I think is detrimental to us as practitioners, but is also detrimental to the ability for the students to dream and do great things in the future. And then, as I'm flipping through some of these studio and the technical course images here, I'll just start mentioning is that thirdly, what we were able to do then at IIT, it was we got an opportunity to organize a symposium towards the end of the term. Symposium on affordable housing that was bringing practitioners from across North America to IIT for this long weekend, and the students in this case got their first-hand sort of knowledge extracted from all of these. There were developers, there were architects, there were city people or policymakers, and the symposium was called Platform Middle, and this is now where we're trying to compile all of our learnings from those sessions into a publication. And so somehow the opportunity for the students to be able to be in that environment with not just obviously us, but with many others. My slide is not changing. There we go. Again, impossible for you to see. Some of our friends, so we have Trevor Bodie, Marianne Amodio, and Harley couldn't make it, but we're there to talk about the housing crisis in Vancouver and specifically what the challenges are and how we might combat them, what the housing as a commodity has done to the world today, and how do we begin as architects to sort of try to alleviate that problem, and what can we do. In that, also the Tower Podium, Vancouver Invention, and culminating this architect housing that's doing completely the opposite of what we probably should be doing in terms of that issue at hand. Marianne talked about sociability and sharing and how she's been able to, through some of her modest projects, been able to build communities in a different way. Rethinking sort of cooperative housing and shared amenities, how you could lock the potential and the value of that for those in need and so on. And again, I don't intend to talk about this all, I just really wanted to give a sort of a quick perspective of all of the speakers. We had Peter Landon, who's a local Chicago architect and deals a lot with social housing projects there. And what the models are that we could learn from one another, what we could bring back here, what we could share with them, and how do we sort of emphasize and build a better equity position for those that are less well off. An interesting thing that came out is this new idea of the hybrid architecture, and I don't know if it's new, but even governments are now looking at not a single use, let's say do affordable housing, but combine that with the library, or in Calgary combine that with a fire station even. So these are public calls, which I find very exciting, so that new sort of hybrid reality perhaps creates better scenarios financially, but also in terms of the vibrancy of cities in the long term. And then we had a developer, Curtis Olson from Saskatoon, actually is part of this, who was sort of emphasizing the fact that we have to challenge what's given to us, and I think that was mentioned in the panel discussion before. We can't just accept the things that necessarily come dealt to us, that we have to be able to question, and I think that's what we learn here in school as thinkers on how to challenge the norm and how to challenge the paradigm that currently exists, and that we have to lead the way in that. You'll hear from Rami, so I don't need to talk about this, from Canva next Thursday, I think. He'll be here, but also their perspective on how to reorganize the architectural practice so that it talks about the totality of the practice world in a new way, and how you can be inherent in the development system so that you have a more say in the outcomes, and they do provocative work. In Montreal, of course, beyond just building, but also the outcomes are this is a student housing project, and again, I'm sure they'll share experiment in materiality at the same time, and sort of iteration upon iteration. That was really fascinating. Okay, and then we had SOM, who sort of talked about the bigger global movements and green technology and housing in general, and had some interesting perspectives in that. Again, looking at sort of sheer size of things beyond just a singular building and so on. So I guess that brings me to the end of the sort of recent trials, and what we're really hoping to pry the conversation open is that we do have, building on some Jay's ideas, Herb's, I think lots of people in this room that have talked about how do we sort of branch out from the school to the broader community for years, and obviously Make's done that in a way, and so we're also contemplating a move that we're hoping that we could get some feedback and partners in and find collaborators and so on. Already that we've been using our own office currently in its setting in the historic building as some of this sort of model of how we could contract and open up to other opportunities. But the new sort of venture is trying to take this to the next level. We have a site near the Portage and Main, between the Portage and Main and the tip of what's becoming the railside development, and we're able to buy that off of our development group a long time ago, and be kind of sitting on it, not knowing what to do. So this is sort of like idea of several concepts that are coalescing together, trying to figure out how we would be able to offer, I guess, something back to this school, as they have obviously, and we owe lots to lots of educators here for our own successes along the way. So how do we offer something back? Is it possible for us to have some sort of model where students could come perhaps work, or we could just give studio space to the school without a cost and so on, for example. And so this idea of the trade craft, so that we could maybe combine better, maybe there could be stints. It's almost like the co-op, but in a sort of more physical way. And then it also got us thinking about all of the other players that potentially could come into play, the other offices that could play a role in it, not necessarily just in this location, but perhaps in their own as well, how we could integrate better the students with what's to come in sense of having contact with Center Venture or other actors that are key to getting projects off the ground successful in the world. And so this is just speculation. Again, we haven't really talked to any of one of these these people yet. But the hope is that we could build something that is sort of flexible and offers an opportunity of habitation in all kinds of possible ways. All right, Sasha, you went to town with this slide. Okay. So here's the site. And so it's 33 feet by 108 feet. This is Winnipeg circa 1920. And that little bit, Tokyo Joe's building, if you know that from the past, is right here. But there's actually a historic house there. And then much of the other fabric is obviously changed over the years. But we sort of discovered that there's actually a historic house on the site. First it was going to be carte blanche and you just go and do something new. But we sort of somehow, even though if you see this house now, you wouldn't believe it, it's pretty crappy. But we somehow got attached to it. And now the thought is that we somehow maintain it as part of the new fabric. And so looking at now from the other angle, William Stephenson Way is on the top and Pioneers on the other side. And so there's the house and there's a little one-story brick building near the elevated highway. So 30 feet wide. There's actually access point from both sides of the site if the house wasn't there, but the house is there. And so what do we do then? Again, these ideas of the ecosystem in the office, and how do we bring them here, that there's a private workspace, but then there's also public programming. Could we somehow make a business model, and when this public program becomes free to use is the hope. Then we started going crazy and separating that and trying to create a roof deck that was online with the rail line. Just imagining this train rumbling by is part of the character and the atmosphere, of course, of the site. And then hoping to sort of work with this, have some public programming there. And then this is an idea about scaffolding being the actual main structural system in the building. And some of the business ideas is not to, in any way, shape, or form to brand this in anything to do with 546, but actually maybe we have to sell billboards. So I'm crossing that over. So that then we can fund design activities, perhaps as a result of the revenue from the billboard business. So we'll see how that evolves. But the thought is basically that this is the gist of it. There's open air in the middle at the moment, and the whole office has worked on this. So there's been sort of brainstorms that have gone on for the past 3 months or so. And then cross passage on the ground floor. We could load up things and have a really rough space. There's archive space in the ground or underground, maybe for WAF if they come with us to this new space, some sort of summer installations, outdoor lectures, and so on. The hope is to have film screenings, maybe an interior garden. So this is just speculation at the moment, but what could occur in the building that's not just a private activity, but is trying to engage the city and hopefully the school maybe, and the students in a different way. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Do you have some questions?
To start, that's a great lecture. My studio is the one that's also focusing on next school, so it focused a lot on what I've been talking about. And the site at the end is actually my site, my studio project. So
okay.
Yeah, it's quite funny. But I really liked when you talked about your studio that you had here, and you kind of went through the whole, like the financial part, and everything that the studio went through was very similar to practice. And I find that very interesting because as I'm going through my studio project right now, coming to almost the end of it, I haven't really thought about the value of the land that I'm working on and that aspect of it. So I was wondering if you think that should be more implemented into the education in my final year, having to do that, because it would be awesome for your studio, but then that was only one of probably 5 studios, so some of the other studios might not have had the same open to what you taught. So I was wondering if you thought that should be implemented, or maybe if there should be other firms coming in and doing studios as well, or how you kind of feel to that.
I'm not, is this on? Yeah. I'm not necessarily advocating that there should be all that. I think it's what we've also learned, and is our downfall in some of these exercises and experiments, is the fact that when we realize that when we put too many limitations on the students, then also the work suffers, and that the free thinking that you're trying to develop in school is stymied perhaps a little bit as a result of all of these practical concerns. And so I think there has to be a balance, and whether that sort of thinking follows immediately after school, but you somehow know it's coming, is what I'm advocating for, because what I'm seeing as a problem is just what feels like a complete disconnect at the moment. And what I'm afraid for is you being kind of stymied then afterwards when you go into, if you go into the practice world, and then being sort of let down by what are the realities in practice. So somehow trying to pave the way for that to occur, whether it's one studio throughout your curriculum here, or whether it's immediately after. I don't know what the right answer is, and I'm not at all posing that we know the answer. But at the same time, we're hoping that, as I mentioned many times, that some of you and your colleagues are better prepared to take on that world, because it is going to hit hard, and we just want to make sure that there are future city builders in the group.
Yeah, just a comment on that. I find that very relevant because coming out of where I am now, I haven't really been in a real firm. I haven't seen what happens in there even, so I'm like, that would be definitely a good way to move forward, is to actually have us just not even be super connected, like not have to work side by side with them, but just be brought into that world a little bit more and understand. So when we come out with our undergrad, hopefully we feel a little bit more prepared to then go into those environments and be like, okay, I've seen this environment before, I kind of understand the stages, and now I can go in and maybe actually speak my mind and say a little bit about certain things, instead of now how I'm going to go into those environments having never really seen them. I don't know and understand exactly how it works. I'm going to be kind of treading lightly. So I think just helping what you were saying.
Thank you again for your talk. I'm really interested in this idea of design advocacy and how we break down those barriers as students, and are thinking of these or having these very socially, environmentally connected discussions of having I guess what I'm trying to say is that we have these discussions about how does design and social issues or environmental issues, how do we bring those two together in practice? It's something that comes up a lot within my studios and my classes, and how do we break down those barriers? And you mentioned in your lecture about, sometimes we get in trouble with the city quite a bit. So how do we, from practice to students, or how do we as students start to learn about how to break down these barriers in the city?
Let me just try to sort of speak to the first part of your comment there. I think that I'm observing that the student body today, or the students that are just coming out of school today, are much more socially conscious than we ever were in our time. I don't know what it was about that moment, perhaps then, that the environment was there, but it wasn't quite as acute. Issues about affordability and so on were a little bit more on the back burner because 2008 perhaps hadn't happened yet, and things like that. So there's always going to be a different kind of zeitgeist to where the focus is. But I'm personally very appreciative of the young people that we have in our office who remind us that this is part of our responsibility as a practice to try to spearhead and do our part in sort of instigating design thinking or values into the general public. But it is kind of like banging your head against the wall kind of exercise all day long, and then you're trying to find the resources and so on. And for example, the walk project that we did was one of the least expensive versions that we've done of any sort of public engagement. That was because we asked and everybody said yes to volunteer for one kind of night to go hang these signs up, because they're engaged and they want to do things. And I think you can, as a student, if you step out into the world, there's probably lots of places where you can volunteer and get involved at boards. I'm sure there's many things that Storefront is doing, for example, where you could take part and be active. There are things like Habitat for Humanity, building houses. There's a lot of social causes that are design related that I think you can be part of. But then also, you're trained to be creative and innovative, and I think it's testing the ground with some sort of a small installation or invention that you have, and just kind of, I would encourage you to go out there and do it. Get some friends together and brainstorm about what could be something that could provoke thought and affect the public's thinking about issues that are important, and go for it. I would love to see that happen more, and fortunately Winnipeg has quite a good culture in that, but we definitely need new actors in that field.
I think I try to talk to my students about philanthropy, about giving, which is usually assigned to very wealthy people. It's an idea. But you can buy art from somebody, you can buy a piece of art from somebody who's a painter, who's going to school, you can support the music in the city. And I just very quickly did a simple calculation. 3 of the 6 projects I'm working on right now, 3 of them are essentially pro bono. So you can always volunteer, you can always do things for, to quote John K. Sampson, the weaker than in the city. It's something that you can do if you're intimidated by doing it alone. You can do it with a colleague or a partner in school. And I think this whole idea of the culture of volunteerism in the city is huge. It's not to say that you're giving your design away free, but it's kind of necessary as a kind of catalyst to begin to establish relationships with people who are not familiar with architecture. I remember visiting Mexico as part of the NAFTA Free Trade Agreement, and we were there to see if it was actually possible to certify Mexican architects under the same protocols we had in the US and in Canada. And we learned that almost every school asked the students to do 500 hours of community work as part of their undergraduate degree. Now that's a country of 70,000 students at that time. But the whole idea of, and you can see it in Sasha and Johanna's and Colin's work, right? They're constantly giving this very presentation is a gift. So I wouldn't hesitate to experiment, to probe the city through the various formal vehicles like Architecture Foundation, but also of your own volition. Who am I talking to? Either you or everybody or Ed? I'm not sure who I'm addressing these comments to.
Well, I'm listening.
Are there any questions from the audience? Deepar.
Thanks for the talk, Johanna. When I look around, it's good attendance. And on the other hand, I miss maybe some people, I would say, maybe I miss the establishment. Also maybe with regards to my profession, I agree. Is this a gift? Yeah, the students, I think they have to pay some fees and also we charge something, but I think it's a gift. So we try to reach out, but on the other hand, how to bring them in? We had so really great lectures, and I have the feeling, and I complain a little bit, especially in landscape architecture, maybe it's a bit too established, and all the projects are done by the same people, almost in the same way, and then we have a world, we open up the world, maybe to new ideas. Where are they? What can we do? Last year we were at the Forks, downtown at 11 in the morning. So what can we do? What do we have to do, as an institution to attract more people for the establishment? Any ideas? Vice versa.
Well, I think what I was trying to, advocate for is that it being a sort of a two-way conversation, because I think our concerns are the same. It's just on the flip side of it, right? And I think the first thing would be to have a proper sit down, have a conversation with the establishment or those who are willing to take part. And again, I'm advocating for the profession to take its share of the responsibility. And I would be the first one to say that we don't have the answers. We would want to have the conversation, though. And we did have the conversation with, I think, Lisa and Carlos when we were heading off to Chicago last year, and sort of saying that somehow we would love to make our interaction with the school more meaningful. And I don't think we've come to an answer yet to what that could be, but we at least would always be willing to and wanting to have that conversation and see where we could contribute. One of the things that I see difficult is that when we were even just trying to have a downtown studio became sort of just from a red tape, I think from higher ups in the university, became impossible. So it would be nice if there was a way that we could break those rules and allow a bit more interaction between the world. I don't know. Again, I'm here to try to pry that open. If there's a way that the professional community could come together with the faculty here, I think it would be wonderful. As far as attendance to lectures, if that's what you're asking about.
Attendance.
Was it attendance or to these sorts of events that? Yeah.
For instance, also in that. Had a chance, to talk with Gary a little bit on my ride to the airport. I was asking about their students. He told me they don't have to motivate their students. They have high tuition fees. They are dedicated.
Right.
When I was in studio, I asked me, how many of you are actually planning to attend Atmosphere? Nobody was saying anything, and it was very clear not too many will be here around. So we had some years, where we made it mandatory. Communism, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know, but maybe we have to do something like this again, to be able to create more pressure.
That's changed a lot since I was a student. Like, we were hungry for lectures when that happened, but I think it was probably because it wasn't going as well at the city. Meaning, it wasn't going as well in terms of the overall offering of events that were design related in the city at that time. It was actually, there was nothing. And so the university was the bright beacon in that if there was an architectural lecture, you were sure to go there, because that was the only thing that was happening. Now I find that, fortunately and unfortunately for the reasons that you're saying, is that there's so much offering that if you're trying to have a balanced life still and get some sleep at times, then you have to make a judgment call. And then if you're closer to your professional community, then maybe that's where it happens, professionals. And for you in the academic world, it happens more here. But we're not seeing necessarily the cross-pollination either in our side. When there are professional events, we don't see as many people from the faculty that we would like to see. And so again, I think it's a two-way street there.
Do you think?
Yeah.
Thanks a
Less
lot.
would be better?
Pardon?
Less is more?
Next question.
Oh, no, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. I don't have the answer.
Thanks a lot, Johanna. It's totally inspirational what you do for your firm with the sharing of the wealth in a way, and that's instructive for every institution, really, and what you're doing for the school and for the city and for the profile of Canadian architecture. So it's a great example that you're setting for all of us. I think with respect to the sharing of knowledge back and forth between academia and the profession, for sure it's something that for generations everyone's been working on. And I also know that we all become so busy, right? That we become locked in, and it's difficult actually on all sides to make space for the opportunities for exchange. Even though we're all doing so many things, it's impossible to attend everyone's events.
Right.
But thinking about what's happened in the community just recently, there was an amazing panel discussion at McNally Robinson, which you attended, and so did over 100 people from the community. I was blown away by the attendance at that event with Brent and Lindsay Oster speaking there. And they're also, so I'm wondering if, in addition to, yes, we always need to do more and there's more that we can do, I wonder if there's also more ways that we can find to share the things that we are doing already that could maybe be bolstered or celebrated. And I'm thinking with all of the lines that came in with the different firms of collaboration downtown, 9 of those firms were here in Center Space just 2 weeks ago for a cooperative education portfolio session, where one professional and 5 to 6 students were sitting down at a table for 1.5 hours. It was amazing. And the students, from what I heard, really valued those sit-down sessions, and that cooperative education program is just entering its 3rd year, and I can't wait to receive the cooperative job postings from 546. So that's something that has been developed in recent years in our faculty as a response in part to issues that were heard in the 10 years prior. So I think there's probably more that we can all be doing to share the case studies that are beginning to work well, and then we can mutually support the bridges that have already been sort of thrown across.
Yeah. No, I agree wholeheartedly, and I probably didn't even mention enough of the, how positive we think that the whole co-op strategy is now, and we're looking forward to taking part in that. And you're definitely right about it, that we are too much in silos still, that even though we're all trying to do a lot, and we're trying to connect, that we could still do better in connecting and pooling our resources, which is part of what I was trying to say. Perhaps maybe I wasn't clear enough, but we have finite resources, all of us do, in taking part in that, and we have a bigger battle to wage than between us. And so, if we can figure out a way that we can come together and do that together, then obviously we would be better as a community. But I just want to comment on the event there that you mentioned with the book launch, that there are also sort of smaller beacons, and I think weirdly enough, Brent's become one where there's a huge public following just because of his Twitter feed, and whatever you might think of his different opinions here and there, it has been very positive, because he's almost like an architectural celebrity in the Winnipeg community with just that. It doesn't require building buildings, it doesn't require a huge amount of resources. Obviously he's staying up with his articles and so on. But it is something where people are now discussing architecture, and they're discussing it in a public forum in a different way. And so that's also something that I think is very accessible for students. Because you can easily start an opinion blog, or you can have a active, whatever it is, Twitter account, or even Instagram. I don't know enough about this stuff, but to be a public influencer, it doesn't take an army. Like, that's something that we can all do to speak about it. And I'm finding sort of on a positive side that increasingly I'm getting invited to by MLAs or by city councilors to speak to their constituents about urban planning or some of the values in community consultation, like this coming Monday. And so it's there's a beacon of hope there, certainly, that our opinion is going to matter again, and we have something to say. And I think that's thanks to some of those individuals who've kind of carried the torch and taken a lot of heat for what they do. Yeah.
Thank you, Johanna, for a wonderful presentation, and I have some thoughts on that, and some thoughts on issues arising even in this last conversation. The idea of bridging the academy and the practice is well taken, and of course we can find new ways to bridge. But that's not. I think we have to move past that. I think we need the bridge itself. We need the Ponte Vecchio. We don't need anything else. I think the bridge is the setting in which we should think about education, design education, and practice. It's a different idea. I like that you're building there. It's iconic to the conversation and germane. In a way, it is a bridge, but and it's connected there to that public gathering space there. But it's interesting, this whole conversation about next school and where we're going into the future. One of the words that stuck in my mind when Tom Fisher presented on Thursday evening, he used the word disruption, and the fact that we are in the process of institutional and political disruption, consistent with some of the other broader forces that are acting in our world, including the environmental issues arising. However, it's interesting to note when you look at the models that are on display in the foyer section. They begin with the Bauhaus Academy by Schinkel, and it was a building designed in and for the Beaux-Arts curriculum, although it had a more practical agenda because it was a German version of the Beaux-Arts. But following along, you get to the Bauhaus, which is the modern, and it's typified by an interesting building, and each are very different ways of thinking about architecture and thinking about the world, and not only education but practice. They were two different models, And then you go along and you see these, quote, hybrids, sort of, as time progresses. And at the end of the installation is the Daniels School in Toronto. And it's interesting because it has a 19th century classical building type, neo-Gothic, thank you, to be specific. And I was trying to think of the specific university Gothic style. In any event, attached to this late modern, this new late modern bit, right? And if you, and we had referenced these in our studio briefing. There was a sepia image of the Bow Academy, then a color picture or black and white picture of the Bauhaus, and then there was a picture of Daniels School. And it was like the Daniels School had taken the Bow Academy and the Bauhaus and put them together. And this was now, in my mind, that resonated because these were architectures that were expressing a pedagogy and a worldview. And it struck me that the Daniels School was now taking the Beaux-Arts and the modern and putting it together and suggesting there's a new agenda. And the year after they built the school, they posed the question, what should a design education be? I thought this was ironic as well. But I find the whole situation of design education and next school to be like remarkably important, yet we're relying on traditional constructs to justify our positions. The world has changed. We need a different building. We need a different school. We need a different practice. And I think that we need that setting to have that conversation. And your practice makes evident of that possibility. And there are many others like it as well. There are a lot of small, really interesting practices that are contributing to the knowledge that you need to practice as a designer, right? We don't have it all here. I work with really bright colleagues, you know, and I'm always blown away, but there are also really bright practitioners, and we have to harness them because we don't have it all. And the industry is changing and the practice is changing. You make that evident in all of the, you put a list of practical things we have to deal with, affordability, healthy housing, and other issues. And we have to get to those. And I think we just simply have to build that, but bigger. And it's going to house the school, and it's going to house your practice and a few others, and it's going to house some maker spaces. And it's going to house the design quarter, that image that you showed us, and all those little offices in town, and we have to think about this differently. I don't think we have to think about this school out here and the workplace down there anymore. I think that's over. Thanks.
I'd like to make a final remark to wrap this symposium by saying that I think Johanna's, just directly to Johanna's keynote, I think you built a very specific culture in your office, which is based on conversation. I think that's something that I take away from all the symposium discussions that we had, and you sort of summed it up in your case study in your own firm. So I think if we can build a culture of conversation, somehow build the capacity of it within our next steps, I think that's promising. And the direction that you posted is actually a hybrid, and this sort of sums up all the discussions that we had. We should tread our steps towards hybrid, I think. That's demonstrated in a lot of discussions as well as yours. And really trade craft, right? I think we have to be crafting our trade, also craft our trade as well as trade our craft, right? So I think that's very insightful in that sense. And then I think the last one, putting it out there rather than insular, I think that's brilliant. So I think I wanted to sum up with your title, the entire symposium, and also hopefully we can linger this discussion beyond and above the symposium throughout the years, throughout the lunch that will be served right after, prolong the discussion. But before we wrap up, I would like to thank the attendants all the participants, speakers, students who participated, moderators, keynote speakers, thank you very much for making this symposium a successful one. Thank you very much.